The development of the M1 carbine represents one of the most significant small-arms stories of the Second World War, and its performance in the Pacific theater, particularly during operations such as the Bougainville campaign, reveals much about the practical realities of infantry combat and the adaptations soldiers made when official equipment did not meet battlefield requirements. The carbine was designed in response to a specific military need, and its subsequent modification by troops in combat zones illustrates the tension between standardized military procurement and the demands of actual combat conditions. The 3rd Marine Division's operations on Bougainville Island in late 1943 provide a particularly instructive case study of how American forces adapted their weapons and tactics to meet the challenges posed by Japanese defensive strategies and the brutal terrain of the South Pacific. The M1 carbine was developed beginning in 1940 in response to a request from the United States Army for a light rifle or heavy pistol that could be issued to troops whose duties made carrying a full-size rifle impractical. These included officers, non-commissioned officers, vehicle drivers, radio operators, mortar crews, and other support personnel. The Army wanted something more effective than the M1911 pistol, but lighter and more compact than the M1 Garand rifle. The Winchester Repeating Arms Company submitted a design that was ultimately selected, and the weapon entered production in 1941. The M1 carbine fired a new cartridge, the .30 carbine, which was intermediate in power between pistol cartridges and full-power rifle cartridges. The weapon was relatively light, at approximately 5.5 pounds, had a 15-round detachable box magazine, and was easy to carry and operate. By the end of the war, more than 6 million M1 carbines had been produced, making it one of the most widely manufactured American weapons of the conflict. The design specifications for the M1 carbine established an effective range of 300 yards, which was based on testing conducted at ordnance proving grounds under controlled conditions. In practice, the weapon's actual effective range in combat was considerably shorter. The .30 carbine cartridge used a relatively light 110-grain bullet with a muzzle velocity of approximately 1,900 feet per second. While this provided adequate performance at close to medium ranges, the bullet lost velocity rapidly and was susceptible to wind drift at longer distances. Combat reports from various theaters, including the Pacific, North Africa, and Europe, indicated that the carbine's practical effective range was closer to 200 yards, and that accuracy and terminal ballistics degraded significantly beyond that distance. This limitation became particularly problematic in the Pacific theater, where combat conditions often differed substantially from those encountered in Europe. The Bougainville campaign, which began on November 4th, 1943, was part of the larger Allied strategy to isolate the major Japanese base at Rabaul on New Britain, and to advance up the Solomon Islands chain. Bougainville is a large, mountainous island covered in dense jungle, with steep terrain, numerous rivers, and volcanic soil that turned to thick mud during the frequent rains. The Japanese had been fortifying the island for months, and had positioned troops in carefully prepared defensive positions. The American landing force, which included the 3rd Marine Division and the Army's 37th Infantry Division, faced not only a determined enemy, but also some of the most difficult terrain encountered anywhere in the Pacific War. The jungle was so dense that visibility was often limited to a few yards. Rivers and swamps impeded movement, and the steep ridges and ravines made maneuver extremely difficult. Disease, including malaria and dengue fever, was rampant. These conditions placed extraordinary demands on American troops and their equipment. Japanese defensive tactics on Bougainville and other Pacific islands had evolved considerably by late 1943. Early in the war, Japanese forces had often conducted aggressive banzai charges and other frontal attacks. By 1943, Japanese commanders had generally adopted more sophisticated defensive tactics that emphasized prepared positions, camouflage, and coordinated fires. Japanese snipers became a particularly significant threat. These were not always specialist snipers in the formal sense, but often regular infantrymen positioned in concealed locations with orders to fire on American troops at every opportunity. Japanese snipers would tie themselves into trees, dig spider holes and bunkers, and position themselves in locations that offered good fields of fire while being difficult for American forces to spot. The Japanese Arisaka rifle, typically either the Type 38 or Type 99, fired a full-power rifle cartridge and was effective at ranges comparable to the American M1 Garand. Japanese snipers understood that American infantry tactics emphasized aggressive movement supported by heavy volumes of fire from automatic weapons and artillery, and they positioned themselves at ranges where they could engage American troops while being difficult to suppress with the weapons most commonly available to American infantrymen. The range at which Japanese snipers engaged American forces on Bougainville varied depending on terrain and tactical situation, but engagement ranges of 300 to 400 yards were common in areas where fields of fire permitted such distances. At these ranges, troops armed with M1 carbines found themselves at a significant disadvantage. The carbine's relatively low-powered cartridge meant that bullets dropped substantially and were easily deflected by wind and vegetation. Attempting to return fire at a sniper positioned 350 or 400 yards away with an M1 carbine was an exercise in frustration, as the bullet's trajectory meant that precise aiming was nearly impossible, and hits were largely a matter of chance. Troops armed with the M1 Garand, which fired the much more powerful 30-06 cartridge, were better equipped to engage targets at these ranges, but the M1 Garand was not issued to all personnel. The table of organization and equipment specified which troops received which weapons, and this was based not only on tactical considerations, but also on logistical factors, such as ammunition supply and weight distribution within units. American troops in the Pacific Theater, as in other theaters, frequently made informal modifications to their equipment to better suit combat conditions. These modifications ranged from minor adjustments to more substantial alterations. Some modifications were officially sanctioned, or at least tolerated, while others were technically violations of regulations, but were ignored by officers who recognized their practical value. The modification of weapons was a particularly sensitive issue, because unauthorized alterations could potentially make weapons unsafe or unreliable, and there were legitimate concerns about maintaining standardization for maintenance and part supply. Nevertheless, historical records and veteran accounts confirm that weapon modifications did occur, particularly when troops believed such modifications would improve their chances of survival. One common modification to the M1 carbine involved adjustments to the sights. The carbine was equipped with a simple aperture rear sight and a blade front sight. Some users found that filing down the front sight post slightly improved their ability to achieve a precise sight picture, particularly at longer ranges where the standard front sight could obscure a distant target. This modification was relatively simple to perform with a file and did not require disassembly of the weapon. Another modification involved shortening the stock or altering its shape to better fit individual shooters or to make the weapon easier to handle in thick jungle vegetation. The standard stock length was designed to fit an average-sized soldier, but individuals significantly taller or shorter than average, or those who needed to fire the weapon quickly from awkward positions, sometimes found the standard stock length less than ideal. Removing wood from the stock with a rasp or file could adjust the length of pull or round off sharp corners that might catch on equipment or vegetation. More controversial were modifications to the barrel. Some troops believed that shortening the barrel would improve handling characteristics, making the weapon quicker to bring on target in the close quarters conditions of jungle fighting. From a ballistics standpoint, shortening the barrel would reduce muzzle velocity somewhat, which would in turn reduce effective range. However, the reduction in length could improve handling, and some believed it could also affect barrel harmonics in ways that might improve accuracy under certain conditions. Barrel. Harmonics refers to the vibrations that occur in a gun barrel when a shot is fired, and the way these vibrations affect the bullet as it travels down the barrel can influence accuracy. Different barrel lengths and stiffness characteristics will produce different harmonic patterns. Whether shortening a carbine barrel in field conditions could actually improve accuracy is debatable, and much would depend on the specifics of how the modification was performed. A critical issue with barrel shortening is the crown, which is the very end of the muzzle where the bullet exits. If the crown is not perfectly square and concentric with the bore, gas escaping around the bullet as it exits can cause the bullet to tip slightly, degrading accuracy. A properly crowned muzzle requires precision machining, and achieving this in field conditions with improvised tools would be extremely difficult. Records from the Bougainville campaign and other Pacific operations document instances of American forces adapting their tactics to deal with Japanese snipers. One approach was to call in artillery or mortar fire on suspected sniper positions, saturating an area with high explosive and white phosphorus shells. Another was to use Browning automatic rifles or machine guns to spray suspected positions with automatic fire, hoping to suppress or kill the sniper even without seeing him directly. Scout sniper teams, which paired a shooter with a spotter, were increasingly employed as the war progressed. These teams used M1903 Springfield rifles, equipped with telescopic sights, and they were trained specifically in long-range marksmanship and camouflage. The deployment of scout sniper teams in the Pacific increased over the course of the war, as their value became apparent. However, in late 1943, during the initial phases of the Bougainville campaign, scout sniper capabilities were still being developed, and many units had limited access to such specialized resources. The 3rd Marine Division landed at Cape Torokina on the western coast of Bougainville on November 1, 1943. The initial landings were opposed by Japanese forces, but American troops were able to establish a beachhead and begin moving inland. Over the following weeks and months, Marines and Army troops expanded the perimeter, fought off Japanese counterattacks, and conducted operations to secure key terrain. Casualty rates varied depending on the intensity of fighting, but sniper fire was a persistent problem. Japanese snipers inflicted casualties not only through direct kills, but also by forcing American troops to move more slowly and cautiously, disrupting operations and causing psychological stress. The experience of being under sniper fire, unable to identify the shooter's location, and unable to effectively return fire, was deeply frustrating and frightening for troops. Officers and non-commissioned officers were frequently targeted, as killing leaders could disrupt unit cohesion and decision-making. Contemporary Marine Corps and Army after-action reports from Bougainville and other Pacific campaigns document the challenges posed by Japanese snipers and the various countermeasures attempted. These reports, now archived in military historical collections, provide insight into how American forces adapted their tactics. Some reports specifically mention the limitations of the M1 carbine at longer ranges, and recommend that troops issued carbines be supported by soldiers or Marines carrying M1 Garand when operating in areas where long-range engagements were likely. Other reports discuss the effectiveness of different weapons against snipers, noting that the best solution was often to use dedicated counter-sniper teams with scoped rifles, or to employ heavy weapons, such as mortars or artillery, to destroy the sniper's position entirely. The question of unauthorized weapon modifications is more difficult to document with precision, because such modifications, if they violated regulations, were not typically recorded in official reports. However, veteran accounts collected by historians in the decades after the war include numerous references to troops making improvised changes to their equipment. Some veterans describe filing sights, modifying stocks, or making other alterations to improve weapon performance or comfort. The extent to which such modifications were tolerated by officers varied. Some commanders strictly enforced regulations against modifying weapons, while others took a more pragmatic approach, recognizing that soldiers and Marines would make changes regardless of orders, and that some modifications were beneficial. In general, modifications that did not compromise weapon safety or reliability, and that improved combat effectiveness, were more likely to be overlooked. One challenge in assessing historical claims about weapon modifications is separating documented facts from post-war embellishment or misremembering. Human memory is fallible, and veterans recounting experiences decades after the fact may unintentionally conflate different events, exaggerate details, or remember things that did not occur exactly as described. Additionally, popular culture and media representations of the war have created narratives that sometimes influence how veterans remember and describe their experiences. Historians must therefore approach veteran accounts critically,
seeking corroboration from multiple sources and comparing personal recollections with contemporary documents such as unit diaries, after-action reports, and official correspondence. When claims cannot be verified through contemporary documentation, historians typically note this uncertainty rather than presenting the claims as established fact. The M1 Carbine's performance in the Pacific Theater was mixed. In close-quarters jungle fighting, where engagement ranges were often less than 100 yards, the Carbine performed reasonably well. Its lightweight and handiness made it easier to carry through
dense vegetation and to bring into action quickly. The semi-automatic action and 15-round magazine provided good firepower for short-range engagements. However, at longer ranges, the Carbine's limitations became apparent. The relatively weak cartridge lacked the penetration to reliably shoot through jungle vegetation or light cover, and its accuracy at ranges beyond 200 yards was poor. Troops who found themselves in situations where longer-range fire was necessary often wished for a more powerful weapon. This experience led to ongoing discussions within the military about the proper role of the Carbine and what types of troops should be issued this weapon versus the M1 Garand. Japanese infantry weapons, by contrast, were generally designed around full-power rifle cartridges. The Type 38 Arisaka fired the 6.5 by 50mm cartridge, while the later Type 99 used the 7.7 by 58mm cartridge. Both of these were effective at ranges comparable to American, British, and German rifle cartridges of the era. Japanese rifles were generally well made and reliable, though production quality declined somewhat as the war progressed, and Japanese industry came under increasing strain from American bombing and resource shortages. Japanese troops were trained in marksmanship, and while their equipment and tactics varied, they were generally competent soldiers fighting from well-prepared positions on terrain they had time to familiarize themselves with. American forces enjoyed advantages in artillery, air support, and logistics, but at the individual soldier level, combat was often a matter of who could shoot more accurately and who had better cover and concealment. The broader question of weapon effectiveness in the Pacific Theater involves not just the characteristics of individual weapons, but also how they were employed within the context of American infantry tactics and doctrine. American infantry doctrine in the Second World War emphasized firepower and combined arms coordination. American infantry units had access to large amounts of supporting fire from mortars, artillery, tanks, and aircraft. The infantry squad was built around the Browning automatic rifle, a light machine gun that provided sustained automatic fire. American tactics often involved pinning enemy forces with automatic weapons fire while maneuvering to flank or assault positions. This approach worked well in many situations, but could be less effective against dispersed, well-camouflaged enemies, such as snipers, who could engage from concealment at ranges where American return fire was less accurate. As the Pacific War progressed, American forces developed increasingly sophisticated counter-sniper tactics. These included better training for infantry in observation and target detection, improved coordination between infantry and supporting arms, and the deployment of specialized scout sniper teams. American snipers in the Pacific Theater used various weapons, most commonly the M1903 Springfield rifle with a unilateral telescopic sight, though some used the M1 Garand with a scope, or other specialized weapons. American snipers achieved considerable success against Japanese forces, and their presence helped to reduce the effectiveness of Japanese sniping. By 1944 and 1945, American counter-sniper capabilities had improved substantially compared to earlier in the war. The experience of individual Marines and soldiers on Bougainville varied widely depending on their unit, their position, and the specific operations they participated in. Some units saw intense combat throughout their time on the island, while others experienced relatively quiet periods. The battle for Bougainville was not a single, brief engagement, but rather a protracted campaign lasting months, with the island not being fully secured until well into 1944. The initial American perimeter around Cape Torokina was expanded through a series of operations against Japanese positions in the surrounding hills and jungle. Japanese forces launched several counterattacks, attempting to drive the Americans back into the sea, but these attacks were repulsed with heavy Japanese casualties.
American forces eventually established airfields on Bougainville that were used to support further operations against Rabaul and other Japanese positions. Casualties on Bougainville were significant on both sides. American forces suffered thousands of casualties, including killed, wounded, and those incapacitated by disease. Japanese casualties were even higher, as their forces were gradually worn down by American firepower and were unable to adequately resupply or reinforce their garrison. The jungle environment itself was a significant enemy, with troops suffering from heat, humidity, disease, inadequate food, and the psychological stress of operating in such difficult conditions. Veterans of the Bougainville campaign often described it as one of the most difficult experiences of their lives, worse in some respects than other battles because of the prolonged nature of the fighting and the unpleasant environmental conditions. The historical record of the Bougainville campaign is preserved in numerous sources. Official Marine Corps and Army histories document the major operations and provide statistics on forces engaged and casualties suffered. Unit histories and after-action reports provide more detailed information about specific actions. Personal diaries, letters, and memoirs written by participants offer individual perspectives, though these must be evaluated carefully as historical sources. Photographs and film footage taken during the campaign provide visual documentation of conditions and equipment. Japanese records, where they survive, offer the enemy's perspective on the fighting. Taken together, these sources allow historians to reconstruct a reasonably detailed picture of what occurred on Bougainville and how American forces adapted to the challenges they faced. One aspect of the Pacific War that affected weapon performance was the environmental conditions. The heat and humidity of tropical climates, combined with exposure to salt water and abrasive volcanic soil, were hard on weapons and equipment. Rust and corrosion were constant problems, and troops had to clean their weapons frequently to keep them functioning. The M1 carbine, like other American weapons, was generally reliable under these conditions if properly maintained, but neglect could quickly lead to malfunctions. Japanese weapons faced similar challenges, though Japanese forces often had more difficulty obtaining adequate supplies of cleaning materials and spare parts, as their logistical situation deteriorated over the course of the war. The modification of weapons by troops in the field raises interesting questions about military culture and the relationship between regulations and practical necessity. Military organizations require standardization and discipline to function effectively, and regulations exist for good reasons, including safety and logistical efficiency. However, military organizations also must adapt to unexpected situations and cannot anticipate every circumstance soldiers might face. Individual soldiers often possess skills and knowledge that can be valuable in solving practical problems, but allowing too much individual initiative can lead to chaos and undermine unit cohesion. The tension between these competing values is a recurring theme in military history. Effective military organizations find ways to balance the need for standardization with the need for flexibility and adaptation. Leadership played a crucial role in determining how modifications to equipment were handled. Junior leaders, such as sergeants and lieutenants, were often in the best position to evaluate whether a particular modification was beneficial or problematic, as they worked directly with their troops and could observe the effects of any changes. Senior officers set the overall tone through their policies and their response to deviations from standard practice. Some commanders were rigid and insisted on strict adherence to regulations, while others were more pragmatic and focused on results rather than conformity. The quality of leadership varied across units, and this affected unit performance and morale. The M1 carbine continued in American military service long after the Second World War, seeing action in Korea, Vietnam, and various other conflicts and operations. Over time, various modifications and variants were developed, including the M2 carbine, which had a selective fire capability allowing fully automatic fire, and the M3 carbine, which could mount an infrared night vision scope. The basic design proved adaptable and remained in use for decades. However, the fundamental ballistic limitations of the .30 carbine cartridge remained, and the weapon was eventually replaced by more modern designs. The experience of using the M1 carbine in the Second World War informed subsequent American small arms development, contributing to discussions about what characteristics were most important in an infantry weapon. The broader context of American infantry weapons development during and after the Second World War involved ongoing debates about caliber, weight, range, and firepower. The M1 Garand was widely regarded as an excellent weapon, but it was heavy and fired a powerful cartridge that produced significant recoil. The M1 carbine was much lighter and easier to handle, but lacked power at longer ranges. After the war, the military sought to develop weapons that balanced these characteristics. This eventually led to the adoption of the M14 rifle in the late 1950s, which fired the 7.62 by 51 mm NATO cartridge, and later to the M16 rifle, which fired the smaller 5.56 by 45 mm cartridge. The M16 and its derivatives have remained the standard American infantry rifle for more than half a century, though debates about optimal rifle caliber continue to this day. The historical study of weapons and their use in combat is part of the broader field of military history and the history of technology. Understanding how weapons performed in actual combat conditions, as opposed to controlled testing environments, provides insight into the realities of warfare and the challenges faced by soldiers. It also illuminates the process by which military technology evolves, as real-world experience identifies shortcomings that drive the development of improved designs. The M1 carbine is a good case study in this regard, as it was a weapon that performed well in some situations but revealed significant limitations in others, leading to lessons learned that influenced future weapon development. For troops who served on Bougainville and other Pacific islands, the memory of the campaign remained with them for the rest of their lives. Many veterans found it difficult to speak about their experiences, as the combination of combat stress, the loss of comrades, and the harsh conditions created traumatic memories. Veterans' organizations and reunions provided opportunities for veterans to connect with others who had shared similar experiences, and many veterans found this helpful in processing their wartime service. In the decades after the war, historians and researchers interviewed veterans to collect their accounts before that generation passed away. These oral history projects have preserved valuable information about the war that is not available in official documents. The Bougainville campaign, while not as well known to the general public as some other Pacific battles such as Guadalcanal or Iwo Jima, was significant both strategically and in terms of the experiences of those who fought there. The successful establishment of American air bases on Bougainville contributed to the isolation of Rabaul and the advancement of Allied operations in the Pacific. The lessons learned regarding tactics, equipment, and the challenges of jungle warfare informed subsequent operations. The human cost of the campaign was substantial, with thousands of American and Japanese lives lost, and many more soldiers left wounded or scarred by their experiences. In evaluating historical claims about weapons and combat, historians must carefully distinguish between what can be documented and what remains uncertain or speculative. The historical record provides clear evidence that the M1 carbine had significant limitations at longer ranges, and that Japanese snipers posed a serious threat to American forces on Bougainville and elsewhere in the Pacific. There is also evidence that American troops made various modifications to their equipment and adapted their tactics to address the challenges they faced. However, specific claims about individual soldiers and their actions require corroboration from multiple reliable sources before they can be accepted as historical fact. In cases where such corroboration is lacking, responsible historians acknowledge the uncertainty rather than presenting unverified claims as established truth. The study of military history serves several purposes beyond simple curiosity about the past. It helps current and future military personnel understand the experiences of previous generations and learn from their successes and failures. It contributes to our understanding of how societies mobilize for war and how technological, tactical, and strategic developments interact. It preserves the memory of those who served and ensures that their sacrifices are not forgotten. and it provides citizens with knowledge about their nation's history and the complex realities of warfare, which is important for informed democratic decision-making about matters of war and peace. The M1 Carbine, with all its strengths and limitations, represents a significant chapter in American military history. The weapon was designed to fill a specific niche, and it performed that role reasonably well, though not without problems. The experiences of troops who carried the carbine in the jungles of the Pacific, the Bocage country of Normandy, and other battlefields around the world contributed to a better understanding of infantry weapon requirements and helped shape the development of subsequent generations of military firearms. The individual soldiers and Marines who adapted their weapons and tactics to meet the challenges of combat demonstrated the resourcefulness and determination that have characterized American military forces throughout history. Their story, based on careful historical research and documentation, deserves to be told and remembered.